The summer heat of 1943 hung thick over the Kummersdorf testing grounds, south of Berlin. Inside a reinforced bunker, a dozen German engineers stood in silence, their eyes fixed on the long tube resting on the examination table. It looked absurdly simple. Crude, even. A pipe with rudimentary sights, a wooden stock, and a trigger mechanism that seemed borrowed from farm equipment. This was America's answer to German armor. This was the weapon Allied propaganda claimed could destroy a panzer. The room filled with skeptical laughter. One engineer, Hauptmann Friedrich Brenner, picked up the weapon and turned it over in his hands like a broken toy. 2.36 inches, he muttered, reading from the captured intelligence report. They expect this to penetrate our steel? Another engineer, younger, eager to prove himself, added, "It weighs less than our Panzerfaust prototype. How can something so light carry enough explosives?" The dismissal was unanimous. To these men, trained in the precision engineering of German weapons development, the American M1 Bazooka represented everything they believed the Allies lacked: sophistication, power, German superiority made visible through steel and science. What they didn't know was that within hours, their confidence would crack wider than any armor plate they'd ever tested. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The weapon on the table had a designation that sounded almost comical to German ears. M1 rocket launcher, 2.36 inch. The Americans had nicknamed it the Bazooka, after a musical instrument used by a radio comedian. To the engineers at Kummersdorf, this only confirmed their suspicions. Only a nation that treated war like entertainment would name a weapon after a joke. But the intelligence reports accompanying the captured weapon told a different story. American infantry units in North Africa had used the bazooka to disable German armored vehicles at ranges the Wehrmacht thought impossible for man-portable weapons. Knocked-out Panzer Mark IIIs and Mark IVs showed impact craters on their side armor, rear plates, and turret rings. Damage that shouldn't exist from such a light weapon. Brenner studied the technical drawings seized alongside the launcher. The warhead was a shaped charge, a hollow cone of high explosive lined with copper. When detonated, it focused the blast into a superheated jet of molten metal capable of burning through armor like a welding torch through tin. The concept wasn't new. German scientists had explored shaped charges years earlier, but they had dismissed man-portable applications as impractical, too unstable, too inaccurate, too weak to matter against real armor. The Americans, it seemed, hadn't received that memo. The testing began on a humid morning in late July. The engineers assembled outside the bunker, clipboards ready, skepticism intact. A captured Sherman tank sat at the far end of the range, its turret removed, its hull painted with measurement grids. Beside it, sections of German armor plating, 50 mm, the standard thickness on a Panzer Mark III's frontal hull. 80 mm, the thickness found on a Panzer Mark IV's turret face. 100 mm, reserved for heavier vehicles. The test protocol was simple: fire the bazooka at increasing ranges and record penetration depth, compare results against known anti-tank weapons, document weaknesses, prove that German armor remained superior. Brenner loaded the rocket himself, sliding the finned projectile into the rear of the tube. The mechanism was disturbingly simple: no complex loading procedure, no precision calibration, just insert, aim, fire. A Wehrmacht private, trained in minutes, could operate this weapon. That simplicity unnerved him more than he wanted to admit. The first shot was fired at 50 meters. The rocket whooshed from the tube with a sound like tearing canvas, trailing smoke and fire. It struck the 50mm plate dead center. The explosion was sharp, violent, and brief. When the smoke cleared, the engineers approached cautiously. What they saw silenced every joke they'd prepared. A hole. Clean, circular, punched completely through the armor. The edges glowed red from residual heat. The shaped charge had done exactly what the Americans claimed. At 50 millimeters of hardened steel, it hadn't slowed down. It had punched through like the metal wasn't even there. Brenner knelt beside the plate, running his gloved fingers along the entry wound. The penetration was surgical. No cracking, no spalling, no signs of structural failure around the impact site. Just a perfect cylinder of molten metal that had burned its way through. "Mein Gott," someone whispered. The younger engineer who had mocked the weapon earlier stood frozen, staring at the hole. "This is impossible," he said quietly. "The warhead weighs barely 2 kilograms." But the evidence was undeniable. The second test targeted the 80mm plate. Same result. The rocket penetrated completely, leaving a wound that would have killed any crew member standing in its path. The third test, against 100mm, showed partial penetration. Deep enough to crack the plate's integrity, deep enough to send shrapnel ricocheting inside a tank's crew compartment. The Germans stood in silence, watching their assumptions burn. For years, they had built their armored doctrine on a simple truth: thick steel wins. German tanks were heavier, slower, and more heavily armored than their opponents because armor was supposed to matter. But the Americans had found a way around mass. They had turned physics into a weapon that didn't care about thickness. The shaped charge didn't batter through armor. It bypassed it entirely, turning the very material of the tank into its own destruction. One engineer, a veteran of the Panzer trials at Paderborn, spoke what everyone was thinking. If the Americans can produce this in quantity. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The implications were already spreading through the group like cold water. The Kummersdorf engineers spent the next 3 days dissecting the bazooka with the precision of surgeons. Every component was measured, weighed, and analyzed. The launcher tube was made of thin-walled steel, lightweight enough for a single soldier to carry yet strong enough to withstand repeated firing. The rocket's fins were stamped sheet metal, crude but functional. The warhead's copper liner was shaped with simple industrial presses, nothing that required advanced metallurgy. What shocked them most was the absence of complexity. German anti-tank weapons like the Panzerbuchse 39 required machined barrels, precision rifling, and trained armourers to maintain. The Panzerfaust, still in development, demanded chemical propellants that were difficult to manufacture under wartime shortages. The bazooka needed none of that. It could be built in any factory with basic metalworking capability. It required no rifling because the rocket stabilized itself with fins. It needed no complex sighting because engagements happened at ranges where a soldier could see his target clearly. Brenner wrote in his report, "The weapon's genius lies not in what it includes, but in what it omits." The Americans had designed for mass production, not elegance, for effectiveness, not prestige. And in doing so, they had created something the Wehrmacht could not easily counter. The shaped charge's penetration capability rendered traditional armor thickness almost meaningless. A Panzer Mark IV, weighing 25 tons and costing hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks, could be disabled by a weapon that cost less than a Wehrmacht soldier's monthly pay. The economic implications alone were staggering. But there was something deeper that unsettled the German engineers. The bazooka represented a philosophy they had never fully understood: American pragmatism, the willingness to accept good enough if it meant putting more weapons in more hands faster. In Germany, weapons development was an art form, a demonstration of engineering superiority. In America, it was manufacturing, a numbers game. And numbers, as the war would prove, mattered more than perfection. By August, the test results were compiled into a classified report and sent to Berlin. The findings were blunt. The M1 bazooka posed a significant threat to all current German armoured vehicles at ranges up to 150 metres. Recommended countermeasures included thicker side armour, spaced armour plates to prematurely detonate shaped charges, and revised tactical doctrine to keep tanks at distance from infantry. But resources were already stretched thin. Adding weight to tanks meant slower vehicles that consumed more fuel. Germany's oil reserves were dwindling. Spaced armour required additional manufacturing capacity that didn't exist. The Eastern Front and North Africa were bleeding the Wehrmacht faster than factories could replace losses. The simplest solution, the one no one wanted to admit, was that there was no solution, not one that could be implemented in time. The engineers at Kummersdorf had done their job. They had analyzed the threat, documented its capabilities, and delivered recommendations. What they couldn't do was change the fundamental reality. Germany had spent years building an army around the supremacy of its armor, and now a tube of welded steel and a copper-lined warhead had made that supremacy negotiable. Brenner kept a personal diary during those months, entries he never showed his superiors. One passage, dated August 15, 1943, read, "We laughed at their simplicity. We mocked their 2.36 inches. But tonight I cannot stop thinking about the hole in that armor plate. Clean, perfect, unstoppable. Perhaps the Americans understand war better than we ever did. They do not build weapons to impress. They build them to win." That diary would remain hidden for decades, discovered only after the war by his daughter. But the sentiment it captured was shared by many who stood at Kummersdorf that summer, the moment when confidence met reality, and reality burned straight through. The intelligence continued to flow in from the front lines throughout late 1943. Reports from Italy described American infantry teams ambushing German convoys in mountain passes, using the bazooka's portability to strike from hidden positions. A single two-man crew could carry the launcher, rockets, and supplies into terrain no anti-tank gun could reach. In the bocage hedgerows of France, where tanks moved slowly through narrow lanes, bazookas turned every corner into a potential kill zone. Panzer crews began reporting a new kind of fear, not the dread of facing another tank in open combat, but the paranoia of unseen infantry waiting in the shadows. The psychological impact was harder to quantify than armor penetration, but no less real. Brenner read these reports with a growing sense of inevitability. The weapon his team had dismissed was reshaping the battlefield in ways armor doctrine hadn't predicted. It wasn't just the penetration that mattered, it was the mobility, the low cost, the fact that a farm boy from Iowa could be trained to use it in an afternoon. By autumn, German engineers were rushing to develop countermeasures and equivalents. The Panzerschreck, a direct copy of the bazooka, scaled up to 88 mm, entered production. It was more powerful, but also heavier, harder to manufacture, and arrived too late to change the war's trajectory. Zimmerit paste, an anti-magnetic coating, was applied to tank hulls to prevent magnetic mines. It did nothing against shaped charges. Schürzen, thin steel skirts, were added to provide standoff distance. They helped, marginally, but added weight and complexity. Every solution was reactive, expensive, and insufficient. The Americans, meanwhile, kept refining the bazooka. The M9 model, introduced in 1944, featured a two-piece design for easier transport and an improved rocket with better range and penetration. Production numbers soared. By D-Day, tens of thousands of bazookas were in Allied hands. Brenner's final report to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht was filed in March 1944. It concluded with a single, carefully worded paragraph. "The enemy has demonstrated that technological sophistication is not synonymous with battlefield effectiveness. The M1 rocket launcher achieves its purpose through simplicity, mass production, and tactical flexibility. Our response must acknowledge this reality rather than dismiss it." The report was read, filed, and largely ignored. By then, Germany was fighting on too many fronts to implement sweeping changes. The engineers at Kummersdorf had done their duty. They had stripped down the bazooka, tested it, understood it, and admitted what it could do. But admitting a problem and solving it were two different things, and time, like armor, was running out. The summer of 1944 brought the Allied invasion of Normandy, and with it, the full weight of American industrial production. German soldiers who had trained to fear the Sherman tank found themselves more afraid of the infantry beside it. Bazooka teams worked in pairs, one loader, one shooter, moving quickly through the hedgerows and ruined villages of France. They didn't need to destroy a tank outright. A penetrating hit to the engine deck, the turret ring, or the rear armor was enough to disable it. Immobilized vehicles became targets for artillery or airstrikes. Even a near miss could shatter morale, sending crews scrambling from their hatches in panic. Wehrmacht after-action reports from Normandy read like catalogues of frustration. Ambushed by infantry anti-tank teams. 2 vehicles disabled before we could return fire. Bazooka fire from concealed positions. It is impossible to locate the enemy before impact. The crew abandoned the vehicle after penetration of the rear hull. No casualties, but the tank lost. The pattern was clear. The bazooka wasn't just a weapon, it was a force multiplier. It turned every infantryman into a potential tank killer, every hedgerow into a defensive position, every street corner into a kill zone. German tankers began modifying their tactics out of necessity. They moved faster, stayed in groups, and kept infantry close for screening. But the bazooka's portability made it nearly impossible to suppress. By the time a tank crew spotted the smoke trail, the rocket was already in flight. For the engineers back in Germany, the reports validated everything they had warned about, but validation without action was just despair in uniform. Brenner, now assigned to a logistics command, watched the war's trajectory with a clarity born from the Kummersdorf tests. He knew exactly how the Allies were winning, not through better tanks or superior tactics, but through the ruthless efficiency of mass-produced simplicity. One evening, over schnapps with a fellow officer, he said quietly, "We built cathedrals. They built factories. Cathedrals are beautiful, but factories win wars." The officer nodded, too tired to argue. By then, everyone knew the truth. They just couldn't say it aloud. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Panzerschreck, Germany's answer to the bazooka, began appearing on the eastern and western fronts in mid-1944. It fired an 88mm rocket with devastating penetration capability, superior to the bazooka in raw power. But it was heavier, required 2 men to operate effectively, and its blast signature gave away the shooter's position immediately. More critically, Germany lacked the industrial capacity to produce them in the numbers needed. By the time the Panzerschreck entered service, American factories were turning out bazookas by the tens of thousands. The production disparity wasn't just a matter of numbers, it was a reflection of 2 entirely different philosophies of war. Germany's war economy, strained by years of conflict and strategic bombing, prioritized quality and complexity. Every weapon was engineered to exacting standards, built by skilled laborers in specialized facilities. The result was equipment that performed magnificently when it worked and when it could be supplied. America's war economy prioritized volume and reliability. Weapons were designed for rapid production in decentralized factories using semi-skilled labor. The result was equipment that might not be the best in class, but was available everywhere, all the time, in overwhelming quantities. The bazooka embodied this philosophy perfectly. It wasn't the most powerful anti-tank weapon, it wasn't the most accurate, but it was light enough for infantry to carry, simple enough for conscripts to operate, and cheap enough to distribute across entire armies. And that, in the end, mattered more than any single technical specification. German soldiers captured in late 1944 often mentioned the bazooka during interrogations, not with fear, but with a kind of weary respect. One Panzer crewman, questioned by American intelligence, said, "Your tank is not so good, but your rockets, they are everywhere. We cannot fight everywhere at once." Another, a young lieutenant from a Panzer Grenadier division, was more direct. "We trained to fight your Shermans. We were ready for that. What we were not ready for was your farmers with tubes on their shoulders." The quote was recorded in an Allied intelligence summary and later cited in post-war studies on infantry anti-tank warfare. It captured the essence of what the bazooka had achieved. It had democratized tank killing, turning it from a specialized task requiring heavy equipment into something any infantryman could attempt. By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe had entered its final phase. Germany's armored divisions were shadows of their former strength, depleted by attrition and fuel shortages. The Allies pressed forward on all fronts, their infantry armed with weapons German doctrine had never accounted for. In the Ardennes, during the Battle of the Bulge, American bazooka teams played a crucial role in blunting the German offensive. Isolated infantry units, surrounded and outnumbered, used bazookas to disable German tanks at choke points. One famous engagement near Bastogne saw a single platoon armed with bazookas and determination hold a crossroads against an entire panzer company for 6 hours. The Germans eventually bypassed the position, but the delay cost them momentum they would never recover. The after-action report from that engagement noted, "Enemy infantry anti-tank weapons proved decisive in preventing breakthroughs. Recommend immediate withdrawal of armor from close-quarters combat with dug-in infantry." It was a remarkable admission. German armor, once the spearhead of blitzkrieg, was now being advised to avoid American infantry. The bazooka had inverted the tactical hierarchy. Back at Kummersdorf, now operating under constant threat of Allied bombing, the remaining engineers compiled their final assessments. Brenner, among them, wrote a summary that would later be discovered in the facility's archives. The M1 rocket launcher represents the future of infantry anti-tank warfare. Its success lies not in technological superiority, but in its understanding of war as a logistical and industrial challenge. Germany designed weapons for soldiers. America designed weapons for production lines. In total war, production lines matter more. The report was never officially distributed. By early 1945, the chain of command was collapsing, but the analysis was sound. The bazooka had succeeded because it acknowledged a simple truth. Wars are won by nations, not by soldiers, and nations win through the ability to produce, distribute, and sustain their armies in the field. Germany had mastered engineering, America had mastered logistics, and in the crucible of World War II, logistics proved to be the superior weapon. The spring of 1945 brought Germany's final collapse. As Allied forces pushed deeper into the Reich, they discovered the scattered remains of German weapons development programs. At Kummersdorf, American intelligence officers found filing cabinets filled with technical reports, test data, and assessment documents. Among them was Brenner's analysis of the M1 bazooka, complete with photographs of the penetration tests and handwritten notes in the margins. The American officer who discovered the file, Captain Robert Mills, had himself carried a bazooka through France and into Germany. He read Brenner's report with fascination, translated by a German-speaking sergeant. "They understood exactly what it could do," Mills said quietly. "They knew, and they still couldn't stop it." The sergeant nodded, flipping through photographs of punctured armor plates. "Looks like they tested it pretty thoroughly, sir." "More than that," Mills replied. "They respected it. Look at this analysis. They're not making excuses. They're being honest about what they're facing." It was a rare moment of professional recognition across enemy lines. The Germans had done their job with scientific rigor. They had tested, measured, and reported accurately. Their failure wasn't in understanding the threat. It was in the impossibility of countering it with a collapsing industrial base and a nation running out of time. In the months following Germany's surrender, Allied technical intelligence teams interviewed captured German engineers and officers. Many spoke openly about the weapons that had surprised them during the war. The bazooka appeared frequently in these conversations. One engineer from Kummersdorf, interviewed in June 1945, said, "We expected American weapons to be unsophisticated, and they were, but that was their strength. They made 10,000 simple weapons instead of 1,000 complex ones." By the time we understood this, it was too late to change. Another officer, a former panzer commander, was more philosophical. "Your bazooka taught us that cleverness can be a weakness. We were too clever. You were clever enough." The interviews were compiled into technical reports that would later influence American military doctrine. The lessons of the bazooka's success shaped post-war infantry weapons development for decades. Simplicity, reliability, and mass production became guiding principles. The M72 LAW, the RPG-7, the AT-4, all descended from the philosophy that the bazooka had proven in combat. Give infantry a simple, effective anti-tank weapon, and they will change the nature of armored warfare. Brenner survived the war and returned to civilian engineering in West Germany. He worked for a construction firm, designing bridges and industrial facilities. He rarely spoke about his wartime service, but his daughter remembered him once pointing to a piece of industrial piping and saying, "The Americans understood this. War is not about making the best weapon, it's about making the weapon you can build fastest." She asked what he meant. He smiled sadly and said, "I learned that lesson too late to matter." In the decades that followed, military historians began to study the bazooka's impact in greater detail. Academic papers analyzed its role in shifting tactical doctrine. Books featured chapters on how American infantry anti-tank weapons had negated German armor superiority. The weapon became a case study in industrial warfare, taught in military academies around the world. What the historians documented was a fundamental shift in how wars were fought. Before the bazooka, anti-tank warfare required specialized crews, heavy equipment, and fixed defensive positions. After the bazooka, every infantry squad became a potential armor threat. The implications rippled through military planning for generations. Soviet forces, observing American success with man-portable anti-tank weapons, developed the RPG series. The RPG-2, introduced in 1949, was essentially a Soviet interpretation of the bazooka concept. Later variants like the RPG-7 became ubiquitous on Cold War battlefields. NATO forces continued refining recoilless rifle and rocket launcher designs. The philosophy remained consistent: give infantry portable firepower, and they can hold their own against mechanized threats. By the 1960s, the concept the Germans had dismissed in 1943 had become doctrine worldwide. A museum curator in Munich, organizing an exhibition on World War II weapons in the 1980s, tracked down Brenner for an interview. By then, he was in his 70s, his memories sharpened by time and distance from the war. "Do you remember the first time you tested the American bazooka?" the curator asked. Brenner nodded slowly. "I remember everything about that day: the heat, the dust, the sound of the rocket leaving the tube, and the silence afterward when we saw what it had done." "What did you feel?" "Respect," Brenner said simply. "And fear, not for myself, but for what it meant. We had spent years building armor to be invincible, and they had built a weapon that made invincibility irrelevant." The curator included the quote in the exhibition. Visitors stood before a restored M1 bazooka, reading Brenner's words on a placard. Many were struck by the honesty. Here was a former enemy admitting not just defeat, but the elegance of what had defeated him. The bazooka's legacy extended beyond its immediate tactical impact. It represented a broader truth about industrial warfare that World War II had proven conclusively. Victory belonged not to the nation with the best technology, but to the nation that could produce and sustain its technology in overwhelming quantities. Germany had built magnificent weapons: the Tiger tank, the MG-42 machine gun, the Messerschmitt Me-2 jet fighters. Each was a marvel of engineering. Each was produced in numbers too small to change the war's outcome. America built adequate weapons. The Sherman tank was inferior to German heavies in direct combat. The M1 Garand rifle was good, but not revolutionary. The bazooka was simple to the point of crudeness, but America built them by the millions and put them in the hands of soldiers who needed them when they needed them. The logistical triumph was more decisive than any single technical achievement. Brenner's final interview, conducted shortly before his death in 1992, touched on this theme. "People ask if Germany could have won the war with better weapons," he said. "But that misunderstands the question. We had excellent weapons. What we lacked was the ability to make them matter. The Americans understood that war is mathematics. Soldiers multiplied by weapons multiplied by supplies. Get the equation right, and technology is just one variable among many," the interviewer pressed him. "Do you think the bazooka changed the outcome of the war?" Brenner considered carefully. The war was decided by oil, steel, and production capacity, but the bazooka changed how we understood armor. It taught us that protection is always temporary, that every shield eventually meets a sword designed to break it. In that sense, it changed warfare permanently. His words were prophetic. The rise of guided missiles, shaped charge warheads, and precision munitions in later conflicts all traced their lineage back to the principle the bazooka had demonstrated. Armor could be defeated by intelligence, not just by bigger guns. By the turn of the 21st century, the M1 bazooka had become a historical artifact, displayed in museums and featured in documentaries, but its influence persisted in every infantry anti-tank weapon carried by modern armies. The concept had been refined, improved, and adapted, but the core philosophy remained unchanged. A small team of soldiers with a portable launcher could threaten even the heaviest armored vehicles. In Iraq and Afghanistan, American soldiers carried successors to the bazooka. The AT-4 and Javelin missile systems were exponentially more sophisticated, but they served the same purpose. They gave infantry the power to fight above their weight class, and that power, first proven on the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes, had never lost its relevance. Military historians writing in the 2010s began to reassess the bazooka's place in weapons development history. Some argued it was among the most influential infantry weapons of the 20th century, not because of its technical specifications, but because of its democratization of anti-tank warfare. One historian wrote, "The bazooka did to armored warfare what the longbow did to medieval cavalry. It gave common soldiers the ability to defeat what had previously been invincible, and in doing so, it forced a complete rethinking of how armor could be used on the battlefield." The comparison was apt. Just as English longbowmen at Crécy had shown that massed firepower could defeat armored knights, American infantry with bazookas had shown that dispersed mobile firepower could defeat armored vehicles. The tactical revolution was comparable in scope. German veterans who lived long enough to see the modern era often expressed bemusement at how much attention the bazooka received in historical accounts. To them, it had been one threat among many, but those who had been engineers, who had tested the weapon and understood its implications, recognized its significance. One elderly engineer, interviewed for a German television documentary in 2008, said, "We laughed at it because it looked like something from a farm. We stopped laughing when it worked. That should have been a lesson, but we were too proud to learn it." The Americans were not cursed by pride. That was their advantage. The testing grounds at Kummersdorf, abandoned after the war and later incorporated into East Germany, were eventually opened to historians after reunification. Researchers found remnants of the armor plates used in the 1943 tests, still marked with impact craters and identification numbers. Photographs were taken, measurements recorded, the holes punched by the bazooka's shaped charge warheads were still visible, preserved by rust and time. A metallurgist examining the plates noted the precision of the penetration. "This is a textbook example of a shaped charge jet," he said. "The focus of energy is remarkable for a weapon of that era. No wonder the Germans were concerned." The plates were eventually moved to a military museum in Berlin, displayed alongside the original test reports and photographs. School groups visiting the exhibit often stopped to touch the jagged metal, trying to imagine the moment when theory became reality, when the engineer's skepticism turned to alarm. Teachers used the exhibit to explain the concept of asymmetric warfare. How a cheap, simple weapon could counterbalance expensive, complex systems. How ingenuity and mass production could overcome technical superiority. The lessons resonated with students who had grown up in a world where technology advanced faster than strategy could adapt. In America, veterans of World War II who had carried the bazooka into combat were occasionally interviewed about their experiences. Most spoke of it pragmatically. It was a tool that worked when they needed it, nothing more, nothing less. But some understood its broader significance. One veteran, interviewed in 2005 at age 84, said, "We didn't know we were carrying a revolutionary weapon. We just knew it could knock out a tank if we got close enough. But looking back, I realize we were part of something bigger. We were proving that ordinary guys could do extraordinary things with the right tools." His words echoed what Brenner had written in his diary 60 years earlier. The bazooka had been a weapon, but it had also been a statement. Wars are fought by nations, not by elites. that production matters as much as genius, that simplicity, when executed with competence, can defeat complexity. As the 21st century progressed, military analysts continued to study the bazooka in the context of modern warfare. Insurgent groups in various conflicts used descendants of the weapon, RPGs and improvised anti-tank rockets, to challenge technologically superior forces. The pattern was familiar. A cheap, portable weapon in the hands of determined fighters could threaten expensive vehicles operated by professional soldiers. Counterinsurgency doctrine began to incorporate lessons first learned when German panzers faced American infantry in European villages. Armor could not operate freely in close terrain without infantry support. Every street corner was a potential ambush site. Mobility and firepower, once the pillars of armored doctrine, became liabilities when the enemy could strike from concealment and vanish before retaliation. The bazooka had taught that lesson in 1944. The RPG-7 reinforced it in Vietnam. Improvised explosive devices proved it again in Iraq. And each time, military planners rediscovered what Brenner and his team had documented at Kummersdorf: that the relationship between armor and anti-armor is not static, that every advancement in protection invites a response, that warfare evolves not through single innovations, but through the constant interaction between offense and defense. In this endless cycle, the bazooka's moment of revolution had been brief. Within a decade, new weapons had surpassed it, but its influence endured because it had proven a principle that remained true across generations. The side that understands the industrial and logistical dimensions of war will defeat the side that focuses only on battlefield performance. Germany had built better tanks, better artillery, better small arms, but America had built more, and more, delivered consistently to soldiers who knew how to use it, had been enough. Brenner's daughter, sorting through her father's papers after his death, found the diary entries from the summer of 1943. She read them with tears in her eyes, seeing her father not as the quiet engineer she had known, but as a young man watching his nation's confidence shatter against reality. One entry, dated July 28th, the day after the first penetration test, read, "Tonight I cannot sleep. I keep seeing that hole in the armor plate. Perfect, undeniable. The Americans have done what we said was impossible, and if they can do this, what else have we underestimated? I fear we are fighting a war we do not understand against an enemy we have misjudged. God help us all." She donated the diary to the German Federal Archives, where it was catalogued and preserved. Historians who read it noted the prescience of Brenner's observations. He had understood, earlier than most, that Germany's defeat was rooted not in battlefield failures, but in the fundamental mismatch between its capabilities and those of its opponents. The diary became a primary source, cited in multiple academic works on German weapons development and strategic assessment during World War II. One historian wrote, "Brenner's entries reveal a man caught between duty and doubt. He served his nation faithfully, but he also saw clearly what others refused to acknowledge. That technical excellence with industrial capacity is a beautiful illusion." The bazooka remained, in historical memory, a weapon that succeeded not despite its simplicity, but because of it. It was the embodiment of American pragmatism, the willingness to build what worked rather than what impressed. And in the final accounting of World War II, that pragmatism had proven more valuable than all the engineering brilliance Germany could muster. In 2015, a joint German-American military symposium was held in Berlin to discuss the evolution of infantry anti-tank weapons. Historians, engineers, and veterans from both nations gathered to present papers and share insights. One session focused specifically on the M1 bazooka and its impact on German tactical doctrine. A German military historian presented the findings from Kummersdorf, including photographs of the original test results. An American historian responded with data on bazooka production numbers and deployment rates. Together, they painted a picture of two nations approaching the same problem from opposite directions. The discussion that followed was marked by mutual respect. German attendees acknowledged that their wartime focus on quality over quantity had been strategically flawed. American attendees conceded that their weapons had often lacked the sophistication of German designs, even as they proved more effective in the aggregate. One elderly German veteran, attending as an observer, stood during the question period. "I was a panzer crewman," he said slowly. "I saw what your bazooka could do. It made us afraid. Not of your tanks, of your infantry. That fear changed how we fought." An American veteran, also present, responded, "We were afraid too. Of your armor, but the bazooka gave us hope that we could do something about it. That mattered more than we realized at the time." The exchange was brief, but it captured the essence of the weapon's legacy. The bazooka had been a tool of empowerment. It had turned fear into agency, helplessness into action, and in doing so, it had altered the psychology of infantry combat as profoundly as it had changed the tactics. As the symposium concluded, attendees were given tours of the military museum. They stood together before the armor plates from Kummersdorf, German and American, examining the same holes that had once shattered assumptions. No one laughed, no one mocked. They simply acknowledged what history had proven, that war rewards those who understand its true nature, and that sometimes 2.36 inches of shaped charge can penetrate more than armor. It can penetrate certainty itself. The final years of the 20th century saw a surge of interest in World War II oral histories. Filmmakers, writers, and historians raced to record the memories of aging veterans before they were lost forever. Among those interviewed were German engineers who had worked on weapons assessment during the war. One such interview, conducted in 1998, featured a man named Klaus Richter, who had been a junior engineer at Kummersdorf during the bazooka tests. "I remember Hauptmann Brenner," Richter said, his voice steady despite his age. "He was a serious man, not given to jokes or exaggeration. When he told us the test results, we thought he was being overly cautious. But then he showed us the plates. We all went silent." The interviewer asked, "What did that moment feel like?" Richter paused, choosing his words carefully. "Like watching a foundation crack. We had built our understanding of the war on certain assumptions, that our armor was superior, that Allied infantry weapons were no real threat, and suddenly we were looking at evidence that those assumptions were wrong. It was frightening, but also fascinating. We were scientists first, and scientists must accept evidence even when it contradicts their beliefs." "Did that change how you viewed the war?" "Yes. From that day, I knew we were not fighting amateurs. The Americans understood war differently than we did. Not better, necessarily, just differently. And their approach had advantages we could not match. I think many of us at Kummersdorf realized, in that summer of 1943, that the war's outcome was already decided. We just didn't want to admit it." The interview was preserved in a digital archive, one voice among thousands documenting the war's complexity. But Richter's testimony stood out for its clarity and honesty. He had been there at the moment when mockery turned to respect, when confidence met reality, and he had carried that memory for 55 years, waiting for someone to ask. By the 2020s, the last living veterans of World War II had nearly all passed. The war that had once been contemporary history was now firmly in the realm of the distant past, studied by scholars and commemorated by descendants. But the lessons it taught remained relevant. The bazooka's story continued to be told, not just as military history, but as a case study in innovation, industrial strategy, and the nature of technological competition. Business schools used it as an example of disruptive innovation. How a simple, low-cost solution can undermine established, expensive systems. How focusing on the customers, in this case the infantry soldiers, actual needs rather than theoretical perfection, can create market-shifting products. Engineering programs cited it as a demonstration of design philosophy. How constraints, cost, weight, simplicity, can drive creativity rather than limiting it. How the best design is often not the most advanced, but the most appropriate for its context. And military academies continued to teach it as a lesson in the relationship between technology and strategy, that weapons do not win wars in isolation, that the best weapon is the one your soldiers can actually use, not the one that exists only in prototype form. The armor plates from Kummersdorf, now over 80 years old, remained on display. In Berlin, the rust had deepened, but the holes punched by American rockets were still clearly visible. Preservation specialists monitored them carefully, ensuring that this physical evidence of a pivotal moment would survive for future generations. School children on field trips pressed their faces against the glass, trying to peer through the perforations. Teachers explained what the marks represented, not just successful weapons tests, but the moment when one nation's assumptions collided with another nation's reality. Some students asked why the Germans had been so confident if the weapon was effective. The teachers would explain that confidence is not always rational, that pride, tradition, and belief can be stronger than evidence, at least until the evidence becomes undeniable. The holes in the armor, they explained, were the moment when denial was no longer possible. In quiet moments, historians sometimes wondered what would have happened if the Germans had taken the bazooka threat more seriously, earlier. Could they have developed effective countermeasures? Could they have shifted their armor doctrine to minimize the weapon's impact? The consensus was no. By the time the bazooka appeared, Germany's strategic situation was already deteriorating. Even if they had perfectly understood the threat, they lacked the resources to meaningfully respond. The war would have ended the same way, perhaps slightly later, but with the same result. The bazooka had accelerated Germany's defeat, but it had not caused it. That distinction mattered. The weapon was important, but it was not decisive by itself. What made it matter was the industrial system that produced it, the logistics network that distributed it, and the army that used it effectively. The bazooka was a symptom of American strength, not its source. And yet, for the men who tested it on that July day in 1943, it had represented something more immediate and personal. It had been proof that their enemies were not the industrial barbarians German propaganda depicted. That American engineering, for all its apparent crudeness, was guided by a sophisticated understanding of war's realities, that the conflict they were fighting was not a clash of ideologies alone, but a contest of systems, and in that contest, the system that could adapt fastest, produce most, and learn from its mistakes would prevail. The bazooka had been one small piece of that system, but it had been the piece that forced German engineers to see the whole machine clearly for the first time, and what they saw had shaken them to their core. Brenner's story, like those of so many engineers and soldiers on both sides, ended quietly. He passed away in 1992, surrounded by family, his wartime service known but rarely discussed. His funeral was attended by colleagues from the construction firm, neighbors, and his daughter's family. No speeches were made about his role in weapons testing. No military honors were rendered. He was remembered as a good father, a skilled engineer, and a man who had carried his past with dignity. But in the archives of military history, his reports and diary entries ensured that his voice would not be entirely silenced. Researchers studying German responses to Allied weapons continued to cite his work. His analysis of the bazooka, written under the pressure of wartime urgency, remained one of the most thorough and honest assessments produced by any German engineer during the conflict. One historian, writing a comprehensive study of World War II infantry weapons in 2018, dedicated a section to Brenner's contributions. Friedrich Brenner exemplified the contradiction at the heart of Germany's war effort, the historian wrote. He possessed the intellectual honesty to recognize his nation's weaknesses, but lacked the authority to correct them. His reports were accurate, his recommendations sound, but the machinery of the Wehrmacht could not implement what he proposed. He saw the truth and documented it faithfully, but the truth arrived too late to matter. It was a fitting epitaph for a man who had spent one summer confronting a weapon that should not have worked as well as it did, who had tested, measured, and reported what he found, even when the findings contradicted everything he had been trained to believe. The bazooka had taught him that simplicity could be sophisticated, that cheapness could be strength, and that the enemy he faced was far more capable than propaganda had claimed. He had learned those lessons thoroughly. History would remember them long after the men who taught and learned them had passed into memory. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.